Hello and welcome to the Car Care Nut channel. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the 2004 to 2010 Toyota Sienna. We're going to be talking about some common problems, things you need to know if you own one or you're buying one. This is going to be a multi-part video in order to give you all the details that you need to know on these cars, and not to make this video super long and boring. I'm going to break it down in multiple parts. In today's video, we're going to be focusing on engines and transmissions and the all-wheel drive system. But before we get started, consider subscribing to the channel if this is your first time watching this video. If you're a returning subscriber, welcome back. And without further ado, let's dig right into it. Starting with the engine category, now this van came with two possible engines. The 3.3 liter 3MZ FE engine came from the 2004 to 2006. The 3.5 liter 2GR FE came from the 2007 to 2010. Let's start talking about the 2004 to 2006 3.3 liter V6. Now, this engine is possibly one of the best engines that Toyota makes. However, as the years add up, as the miles add up, they do have a few common problems that you need to know about. First, let's start with oil leaks. Now, the valve cover gaskets are super common to leak on this engine. With age, they're just rubber gaskets. One thing I will recommend to you, if you see this leak, it's a good opportunity to replace the spark plugs as well while you're there. You're going to remove the intake plenum anyways. Might as well save yourself labor. Why do this later and pay double? Another common leak on these, and this is coming with age, is the cam seal and the crank seal. These are seals that sit behind the timing belt, behind the cam pulleys and the crank pulley, underneath where the timing belt sits. Again, this engine does have a timing belt, which is something you need to do every 9 years or 90,000 miles. So I recommend to you, even if these seals are not leaking, when you do the timing belt, do put new ones, because these seals tend to get old and brittle and they break and start leaking. Now, let's move on to a few coolant leaks. The water pump is very common to leak on this engine. Again, they don't leak before you need to do the timing belt. So if you're doing a timing belt, replace that water pump always. Whether it's leaking or not, you always want to put a new water pump. If this water pump, for some reason, decides to leak so bad, seize up or break or have vibration, it could cause the timing belt to come off or get shredded. So something to know about that one. Another common coolant leak on this engine is there's a coolant cover or plate. We call it coolant plate. It sits underneath the intake manifold. And this thing loves to leak. It's really hard to see it leaking on the car. All of a sudden, just coolant starts disappearing and you're looking and looking and you don't see anything leaking. The best way to find this one is, and maybe you can relay this to your mechanic or you can go dig in yourself. You look for a coolant trail right behind the thermostat. It looks like it's coming from the thermostat, but it goes past it. That's usually when the leak gets really big and it starts coming out of the V-bank. Now, this next coolant leak is not really related to the engine itself, but it is so common. Radiator coolant leaks. I mean, this van is notorious for radiator problems. However, it seems to be worse in 2004, and you can recognize that with the all aluminum radiator. 2005 and 2006 seems to have an improved radiator, though it could still leak, but not as much as the 2004. It does have plastic cores, the 2005 to 2006. One more thing that is very common on this engine is knock sensor and knock sensor codes. Knock sensors are two little sensors. They sit underneath the intake manifold. They help your engine detect knock and back off the timing. I know that's too technical. Two sensors, let's keep it simple. Now, these two sensors have a little wire that run from the sensors a little bit out because they're really buried underneath the intake manifold. Now, that area gets really hot. This wire bakes, even the sensors, and sometimes either the wire breaks or the sensors go bad. They're very common on this. One thing I'll recommend to you, if you're gonna do knock sensors or you're gonna replace the intake plate, that plate that we talked about, always, if you're doing one, do the other, because they're in the exact same spot. If you're doing that intake plate to reseal it from leaking coolant, you're going to remove the knock sensors and the wire, and likely that wire is going to break. So if you're there or your mechanic is there, have them replace the knock sensors, have them replace that wire. Yes, it's a little bit of added expense in parts, but trust me, you're going to save on labor. If you're doing this yourself, also, unless you want to do all this job all over again. So to wrap that up, I'm going to say there's two combos in this engine. Every time you do the coolant plate or the knock sensors, I actually recommend you do the valve cover gaskets and spark plugs and a PCV valve. All this labor overlaps each other, and if you're DIY, hey, you're there, you did all this work, might as well be there once and be done with it for the next 10 years. And the second combo, I will call them combos, is if you're doing a timing belt, always do new drive belts, always do new water pump, new cams, and crank seals. Do it once and be done with it for the next 9 years, 90,000 miles. You won't have to go back in there for a little coolant leak or oil leak. Moving on to the 2GR FE engine, this guy came from 2007-2010, 3.5 liter V6. This engine is a great engine. However, this was the first year that it's in this van, and the first couple of years we've had a few issues. Some of them are pretty serious. Now, if you're buying a van or if you own one and you start it in the morning, this engine should start up very quiet, smooth. If you hear a rattling noise up to 5 seconds, like a deep metallic rattling noise, these are the variable valve timing gears actually coming apart slowly. It progresses from that rattling noise to consistent ticking all the time to the gears coming apart, and then the chain comes apart, and we've seen some pretty catastrophic engine damage from this. So something you need to know if you're looking to buy one, do not buy one with a rattling timing gear. If you own one that does, keep an eye on it. If it progresses to the ticking noise, you need to get it fixed, because this could turn into a much bigger problem. They're very expensive to fix. Engine out job, and we're going to talk about a combo for this one in case you face fixing this one. Another common oil leak, actually 3 oil leaks on this engine. 2 of them are very important that you know about. There is an oil line that runs a little bit to the front of the car. It's for the back bank VVTi oil feed. This is a metal line that for some reason Toyota decided to put a little rubber section. This rubber section gets brittle over time, and it leaks, ruptures, and leaks all the engine oil in no time. Now, there was a campaign to replace this, but I want you to make sure that this was actually done. If not, there's actually a part that you could replace it with that is it's an all metal line, and you won't have to worry about it. The second leak is on the front of the engine, on the front of the car, there is an oil cooler line. This is, again, same thing, metal line, has a rubber, actually 2 rubber pieces on it. Now, this was covered by Toyota for some time, but that coverage could have expired. You need to call your dealer to inquire. If you buy a car, you own one that has a rubber, replace it with an all metal line. Trust me, it is money well spent. I have seen so many engines that run otherwise beautifully fail and completely get destroyed because of these 2 oil leaks. Something you need to know about. The last oil leak on this engine is from the front timing cover, and a good way to find this leak is to lean underneath the van on the passenger side through the wheel well and look up at the engine. You're going to see the belt, you're going to see the power steering pump, you're going to see it covered with oil. Most people think, oh, it's a power steering pump that's leaking. No, it's usually the front timing cover, and again, engine has to come down and all this nice mess. So if you're ever in a situation where you're doing any kind of leaks on this engine and the engine is coming out, always do the gears, replace the water pump, which is another very common leak on these. They either leak or rattle. You're going to be replacing water pumps left and right. They're very DIY, you can do them. A little expensive on the labor side if you have a mechanic do it. But another big issue with this engine, and it's unknown if it has to do with rust. Some people say it does, but I've seen it on cars that have no rust on them. The head gasket leaks. It doesn't mix coolant and oil and turn into the milkshake, but you'll see coolant leaking externally. Like at the back of the engine, you'll see it just covered with coolant from where the head gasket is down. Again, if you're doing a head gasket, You're gonna already do the front cover leak and you're already gonna be at the timing gear, so I would replace them if I were you, if you're spending all this money. Two more things on this engine, and I know it sounds like a terrible engine, but it's actually most of these problems were significantly improved by around the end of 2008 for 2009 and 10. So these are the kind of problems that if you don't have them and you take care of your van, you're not gonna get them. These vans, this engine is really good. If you take care of it though, if you don't, we're gonna have problems, unfortunately. Another couple things that I wanna mention, screeching or grinding noises as the engine is running goes up and down with the engine consistent all the time. There are 3 idler pulleys, they're right there, they're not expensive to replace, they're notorious to go bad, and again, there is an updated part, so this is a one-time thing where you're going to replace it once and be done with it because the part has been updated. Another common one that leads people to replace all kinds of stuff and never find this, it's a squeaking sound. When the car is cold, you hear squeak, 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 then it goes away. People put a belt, people put a tensioner and waste all this money. It is super common for this van, for this noise to be caused actually by the alternator. And a good way to find it, it's not 100%, but most of the times, is by unplugging the connector on the alternator. If you unplug it, noise goes away, guess what? Needs an alternator, not the tensioner, not all this stuff that people replace usually, which I know it doesn't make sense, but that's just the way this van is. Last on this engine, they're very common to use to go through ignition coils. You get a misfire code, they're very easy to diagnose. The front 3 are very easy to replace. If you're ever finding yourself doing spark plugs on your own or you have a trusted mechanic, I actually recommend you replace the back 3 coils because it's kind of a laborious job to get to the back. It's not very difficult DIY, but if you're paying labor, and the coils are coming out, I would recommend you invest in putting 3 new coils, especially if you're keeping this van. The front 3 coils, not worth it. They're right there. You can actually replace it even if you're not a DIY mechanic. There's 1 bolt, 1 connector, boom, it's out. It takes you 5 minutes. But the back ones, they're a little buried, so food for thought, I suppose, if you own one of these vans. Moving on to transmissions. And this van had a pretty solidly reliable transmission. There are a few exceptions though, and a few issues that you need to be aware of. The first issue is, for some reason, 2010 vans, we had a herd of them initially when they came out within the first 3 years that had noise on deceleration. You accelerate fine, transhift's fine, perfectly, you let go of the gas, a huge rattling noise as you're slowing down. This comes from the this actually comes from the final drive and the transmission, and we've seen a couple of them that completely blew up. The final drive just got destroyed. It's unknown why this was only 2010. I mean, you'd think the last year of production is the best one, but in this case, it's not. So be aware of this. I have doubts that you're gonna see this in the real world 10 years later, as the date of filming this video. But in case you drive one, you hear that, pay attention to it. Accelerate, not hard, just normal acceleration, 40 miles an hour, and let go of the gas and listen. Tell the salesman to stop yapping in your ear so you can actually listen to it. Because if you see that, turn around, go back to the dealership, walk away. We're not buying this van. Another thing on the transmission, this applies to all of them, 2004 all the way to 10. They're notorious for transmission oil leaks. Not huge leaks, but few drips here and there. And most people misdiagnose this as a transmission oil pan, and now you're paying money or wasting your good weekend replacing that oil pan, and guess what? A month later, it's leaking again. Well, the common culprit for this is the case. The transmission case have 2 halves, and they have sealer in between them, and they're clamped together. Well, that sealer over time wears out and starts leaking, a very minor leak. But over time, it collects into drips, and now you see it covered. Please don't fix this. This is just, you're taking, now the van, the newest one of these vans is 10 years old. You're taking this transmission apart that is 10 years old, probably has 150,000 miles, just to seal a little leak, risking everything inside of it going bad. It's not worth it. just wipe it off, put a little cardboard underneath it. Do not, because this is super expensive. The trans has to come out, and I see people do this, and it's like, why are you doing this to yourself? Please stop. It is not worth the investment, and the leak in 3 years will form 2 drops. Is that really a leak? It is not. And if someone tells you it is, we got a problem. Another leak. Now let's briefly go into the all-wheel drive. The transfer case also loves to leak. There's a little cover. Once the transfer case is out of the car, it takes you 2 seconds to seal it. However, again, the trans has to come down, and now we're disassembling the whole car for a little leak that is really not worth it. I mean, you're going to drive a year, maybe you'll drop an ounce of the transfer case fluid. It's not worth it, people. If you see one though that's leaking on a car you're buying, I'd perhaps look for one that's not leaking preferably, but if you see it, it's not the end of the world. So something you need to know about. Let's go back to the transmissions for a second. There's one thing that is actually a transmission killer in these vans. It has nothing to do with the transmission itself, but you need to know this. The radiator, again, we go back to the radiator, and you're getting the theme of this. The radiator has a transmission cooler in it. There's 2 fittings that are pressed into the radiator, and the cooler is inside. I have seen so many Siennas lose their transmission to the cooler line breaking off the radiator. I mean, countless. If that happens to you, if you don't continue to have the car running, you could actually salvage the transmission by basically adding fluid, changing the radiator, and you could get lucky. But I've seen so many people not be lucky because they didn't know what happened. They kept the van running, and now you're running the pump without fluid, and guess what? The pump is gone, and now we're either taking the trans apart to replace the pump or replacing the whole trans, and it went from something very simple as a radiator to now we need the trans. So how do you know if this is going to happen to you? Unfortunately, you don't, because there's really no indication. All of a sudden you're driving, all of a sudden this thing pops, leaks all the fluid, and there's no trans anymore. So my advice to you, if you own one of these vans, or if you just bought one and you have no actual record of it getting replaced, just go ahead and replace the radiator. You're not gonna, it's money well spent, because a radiator will cost you, I don't know, $300-400 to replace, for example. A trans is gonna be $3-4 grand, $3,000-4,000. You do the math. I'd rather buy the cheap insurance than pay the whole trans. So food for thought for you, I suppose. One last thing before we wrap up this video. On the all-wheel drive models, there is a little mount, probably about this big, has a rubber bushing in the front on the rear differential. This rubber bushing is notorious to break, and the common symptom of this is you drive the car, your van, you accelerate, and you hear like a big rattling, huge rattling noise from the back. The faster you go, the heavier it gets. It's a little mount, probably this big, takes you 10 minutes if you're DIY to replace. It's not the end of the world, as long as you make sure that that's it, not something else. Doesn't hurt to check it, doesn't hurt to know about it. It scares you when it does go bad, but it's just a little mount. You buy it from the dealership or aftermarket, whatever is best for you. You replace it and life is good. It's as simple as that. Just you need to know about it. So I'm gonna wrap this video right here. One thing I will tell you about these vans, these are actually great vans, and at the prices you can get them today, if you can find a good one in good shape or willing to do a few repairs to it when you buy it, these are actually great buys because they're very reliable. They do have their issues like anything else, but overall, compared to similar vans from other manufacturers of the same miles and same age, this is a top van you can buy. There's nothing that even comes close. But just do your homework, check the van right. Don't buy one that's neglected. If you like this video, consider giving it a thumbs up, consider subscribing to the channel. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and we will see you in the next part of this video.